Bonjour. It is wonderful to be here in Paris, in France, in the birthplace of supersonic passenger flight, to be talking about the rebirth of supersonic passenger flight. Could I get my first slide, please? Thank you. 200,000 years of human history, and it's taken place here on Earth. And for most of that 200,000 years, we could go only as far as our feet could carry us. Most people were born and never went more than 20 miles from their birthplace. In the early 1800s, journeys over long distances were on wagons, and they were usually one way. In the mid-19th century, we had a breakthrough innovation, the long-distance railroad, and it made possible to do long journeys and still have the hope to come back. And of course, in 1903, the Wright brothers built the first airplane, and scarcely 30 years later, now we had long-distance passenger airplanes, and one could fly across the continent in as little as 20 hours. If you were traveling across oceans in the 1950s, you'd take one of these. For example, if you lived in San Francisco and you wanted to vacation in Hawaii, you would take a flying boat, and the trip was 16 hours. Many people chose not to go. And I think to better understand the value of speed, it helps to look at what happened when we went from those propeller aircraft to the very first jets. It changed everything. That 16-hour flight became a 6-hour flight. And what happens is people chose to go way more often. Hawaii vacation became a thing. People built hotels and resorts and tourist attractions. And travel went up 6x in the first 10 years, basically everywhere you look. Travel across the Pacific, travel across the Atlantic. It became possible to do business in new places and have friends in new places. But it wasn't just about where you could go. It was also about what could come to you. For example, music was previously quite local, and the jet age made it possible for musicians to travel the world. The first world tour was the Beatles in 1964, a tour that would have been impractical just a decade earlier. And by the late 60s, the world knew that the next step forward would be supersonics. Even faster aircraft that would be to the jets what the jets had been to the piston propeller aircraft that came before them. Aircraft that would let you fly across the Atlantic and be at home in time for dinner, or fall in love with someone on another continent. And we did have Concorde, a marvelous technical achievement, but something funny happened. We flew it for 27 years, and then it got rusty, and today it's only in a museum. And so for the last, really, few decades, what we've had is aircraft that are more efficient, but are no better at getting you from point A to point B than they used to be. So if you're fortunate enough to fly premium class, well, we can at least make the experience a little bit better, make it easier to pass the time while you're flying. But the reality is the barrier of time is still a barrier to having experiences on the planet, experiencing the wonderful people and places and culture. And when a flight takes 8 hours or 16 hours, we often choose to stick closer to home, and our experiences are more limited. So at Boom, we are motivated to bring about a supersonic renaissance. Looking back at Concorde, it was really amazing what was achieved half a century ago with slide rules and wind tunnels. And we're going to stand on the wings of Concorde and build a new generation, a second-generation supersonic aircraft that will be far more mainstream than Concorde ever could be. And so if you say, well, what was wrong with Concorde? Why is it not flying anymore? And as many of you know, the basic answer is economics. It was built with the best of 1960s technology, which means it was a gas guzzler, consumed an incredible amount of fuel, forcing ticket prices to be incredibly high. A round-trip ticket across the Atlantic would cost about $20,000. I don't know about you, but for me, that's like a bucket list item, a thing to do one day, not practical transportation. It's just too expensive. And with 100 seats on the airplane, airlines couldn't fill the seats, and usually Concorde flew mostly empty. So it couldn't work on many routes, especially routes that are less trafficked, and only 14 ever went into service. So if we want to build a new generation supersonic aircraft, we really have to do two things beyond Concorde. Number one is we have to improve the fuel efficiency of the aircraft so it can be less expensive to operate, and so fares can be cheaper. And then number two, we have to right-size the airplane, put the right number of seats on it, such that it can be practical, not just on a couple routes, but on hundreds of routes around the planet, achieve economies of scale, and really change transportation. So that's what we're doing at Boom. This is the Boom aircraft, standing on the wings of Concorde and using modern technology. 55 seats on the airplane, similar to what you'd find in the business class cabin of a wide-body aircraft from Airbus or Boeing, yet significantly faster, 2.5 times faster than anything else you can get today, and even 10% faster than Concorde. Yet unlike Concorde, thanks to economies of scale and new technology, we can reduce operating costs by 75%, which means you could fly on this for the same fare as business class. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, geez, business class, that would be nice to fly. This is the starting point. It's the first aircraft. And over time, our goal is to reduce the operating costs even further so that anyone can fly supersonic. So when you do that, when you get down even just to a business class price point, it completely changes the applicability of supersonic transportation. Concorde, again, made money on 1 or 2 routes, New York, Paris, New York, London. But with this aircraft at business class costs and with a 50-seat cabin, works on over 500 routes all over the planet. Not just Paris to New York, but LA to Tokyo, Seattle to Shanghai, to Sydney. To talk about some of these routes, so let's say you're in Paris and you'd love to visit New York. Instead of that being an excruciating 7-hour flight, it shrinks to just 3.5 hours. And what that means is you can work a full day in Paris, catch an evening flight, and still make dinner in New York. Or in the other direction, you can catch a morning flight from the US and be in Paris in time to make an afternoon meeting, and back home in time to tuck your children into bed. This isn't just about saving a couple hours here and there, although that would be plenty exciting. This is about changing what you can do in a day. One more example, Paris to Sao Paulo. Today that's a 12-hour flight that becomes just 6 hours. You can start your vacation a whole day earlier. And across the Pacific, it makes arguably even a bigger difference. Today, if you're in San Francisco and you need to make a meeting in Tokyo, it takes a minimum of 2 days. But with supersonic, as the flights shrink, you could leave San Francisco in the morning, be in Tokyo just a few hours later, in the morning Tokyo time, get your meetings done, and still be home before midnight. So that's the promise of supersonic travel. I'll talk a little bit about why it's finally possible today. And of course, Boom is a new company, a small company, and we have to be very conservative in a way with how we go about building this. And so we have a tech policy, which is no new technology on the first airplane. We're borrowing from the best technology that's been developed in the name of efficiency on subsonic aircraft, and instead of using it to get another 1% or 2% improvement in subsonic efficiency, we're focusing on the human part and deploying that same technology in service of allowing people to do more with their lives. And that there are really 3 things that have gotten better since Concorde's time that make this possible: aerodynamics, materials, and propulsion. So I'll speak briefly about each of those. On aerodynamics, actually until very, very recently, the way you would design the aerodynamics of an airplane is to build a model and go to a wind tunnel. And each iteration in a wind tunnel takes about 6 months. And therefore, it's not practical to test very many designs. Concorde's designers were able to test about a dozen aerodynamic designs before it was time to go build and fly the airplane. Today, you can do almost all your aerodynamic development in computer simulation, where 6 months of wind tunnel testing turns into just 30 minutes of computer time. And as a result, you can test thousands of designs. It feels like cheating. You can test many, many ideas, and most of them aren't any good, but you can find a few that really help. And we found a few that make a big difference. A swept trailing edge on the wing, a feature called a chine, a little wing that extends all the way up to the nose, as well as refined airfoils. So that's aerodynamics. The second key technology is carbon fiber composites. And we have a debt here to, again, Airbus and Boeing for pioneering this on subsonic aircraft. But it turns out that composites are even a bigger deal for supersonic than subsonic. And the biggest reason is that a supersonic aircraft has a very dynamic fluid shape. There's hardly a straight line anywhere on our airplane. And building that out of aluminum would be prohibitively expensive. But in carbon fiber composites, you can make a part any shape you want. The way it works is you start with a high precision mold, which you can either machine or 3D print. And then you lay up layers and layers of carbon fabric in that mold, and finally cure it in an oven or autoclave, giving you the exact shape you want, the shape that you want for the ideal aerodynamics and a strong, lightweight part. The other thing that matters about composites is they actually take higher temperatures far better than aluminum. The reason Concorde was a Mach 2 airplane actually was that the higher speeds beyond that, the aircraft would become too hot for aluminum and it would get mushy. You don't really want a mushy airplane. But carbon composites can go up to hundreds of degrees, and so materials are no longer a speed limiter, and we can design for higher speeds. Last but not least is propulsion. Concorde was the only passenger aircraft ever to fly with afterburners. And if you're an airplane geek like I am, afterburners are just the coolest thing. Where we work just south of Denver, F-18s come by frequently and full afterburner, and you can't miss them because they're really loud, they turn heads, and at night you can actually see the flame coming out the back. It looks really cool. But if you're an airline or a passenger, afterburners aren't so great because the flame is like the airplane's on fire. It's kind of scary. And the noise is really bothersome to people around the airport. And last but not least is the fuel efficiency. On Concorde, when they would flip on afterburners, the fuel consumption went up 78% for just 17% more thrust. So it's a really bad way to get additional thrust on your aircraft. Now, the designers of Concorde weren't silly. They were just working with the best of 1960s technology. And since then, we've completely changed the way we build jet engines. We have a new thing, of course, called a turbofan, which is significantly more efficient and quieter. And you don't need an afterburner to go fast. You can get plenty of thrust from a turbofan. So basically, we are taking modern turbofan engines and adapting them for supersonic flight. For a subsonic airplane, you have a turbofan with a great big fan on the front. The faster you go, the smaller the fan you want. And we have what I think of as a Goldilocks fan or a middle-sized fan that is a compromise between being quiet enough around the airport, being friendly to people on the ground, but also being compact and efficient for high-speed flight. So that's the aircraft, technologically speaking. Aerodynamics, materials, and propulsion give us huge gains in efficiency compared to Concorde. And we're taking most of those gains and using them for improved efficiency, for lower fares, to make supersonic travel more affordable than it ever could have been. But we're also taking some of that efficiency and using it to improve the onboard passenger experience, to put a more spacious, comfortable interior in the airplane than Concorde could have had. So this is the new supersonic business class. The aircraft with 55 seats has one seat on each side of the aisle, which means you don't have to choose window or aisle. You get both. Great big windows and an overhead bin at every seat, so you never have to worry about where your bags are going. And my personal favorite feature is that cup holder that's nowhere close to where the laptop is. That would have saved me several times. For longer flights across the Pacific, you can also configure it with a first-class, fully lay-flat configuration. And those flights today that are 15, 16 hours, that are just so excruciating, suddenly turn into an overnight. Go to sleep in Los Angeles, wake up in Sydney. Now, again, Boom is a relatively small company, 35 people, growing quickly. And the right thing for us to do first is not to build a massive commercial supersonic airplane. So we're starting with something smaller, a proof of concept, the XB-1 supersonic demonstrator, or Baby Boom, as we like to call her. This is basically a 1/3 scale realization of our passenger aircraft design, the same aerodynamics, same materials, same kind of propulsion flow path, just smaller. And that aircraft, we just finished the design for. We're starting assembly later this year, and this will fly late next year. So that will be history's first privately developed supersonic passenger aircraft, the fastest passenger aircraft ever made, and 10% faster than Concorde next year. There's the baby aircraft together with the Mama Boom aircraft. And like I said earlier, we have a vision for creating many, many new generations of aircraft. If you look back in history, as I said earlier, when flights get faster, people choose to go more often. They visit places and people that otherwise they wouldn't see. This increase in passenger volume means the aircraft need to get larger over time. And as they get larger, they can be made more efficient, enabling ticket prices to come down and travel to be affordable to more people more of the time, which means we can make the aircraft larger and more efficient and more affordable, and larger and more efficient and more affordable. And that starts a feedback loop, a virtuous cycle that I believe within a few generations will make it possible for all of us to travel supersonic and rarely consider a subsonic flight, except for cargo. We're doing all of this in the US. We're based just south of Denver, Colorado, at a wonderful little airport called Centennial, which is a 100-year history of flight tests of new aircraft. And we will be doing the first flight of our aircraft there late next year, subsonic testing near Denver, and then going to the Mojave Desert in Southern California in partnership with Virgin Galactic to do our supersonic flight test program. And once we're seeing the performance that we expect on our small airplane, we'll launch the development program for the full-scale aircraft, looking to start our full-scale flight test program in 2020 and the first passengers in 2023. So it takes a few years, but it's a complicated process for safety testing, for certification, and we're going to do those steps as quickly as we can, but not skip any of them. To express our vision of the importance of faster travel and how we see it really impacting life and culture, we made a short video that I'd like to play for you now.
The pursuit of speed is often relegated to the adrenaline seekers, the risk takers, the record breakers. But our pursuit of speed is about something greater. It's speed in service of the experiences that make life precious. Imagine, if you will, flying across the Atlantic, doing business, and being home in time to tuck your children into bed, or where New Zealand becomes as accessible as New York. What would that do for families, for culture, for business? The technology for supersonic flight has existed for over 50 years.
This is the new supersonic airplane.
But it was too expensive for routine travel. At Boom, we are refining it, perfecting it, so that high-speed travel can be available to anyone. In the digital age, there really is no more distance. There is only time. Time from one another. Our mission is to remove that barrier, meaning more meetings in a day and more nights with loved ones. Where children grow up with their parents at home, and where relationships are no longer considered long distance. We see New York to London in 3 hours instead of 7. San Francisco to Tokyo in 5 hours instead of 11. We see world leaders spending more time in the same room, the acceptance of cultures, and the spreading of ideas. At Boom, we see the time saved as really the least important part. This isn't about time saved, it's about life gained. Together, we can make cities into neighborhoods and make the world a smaller place. Boom. The future is supersonic.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to follow along with our progress as we go towards a supersonic renaissance, you can subscribe to our mailing list at boomsupersonic.com or follow us on Twitter at @boomaero, BOOMAERO. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience, and thank you for your support.